Good day. Today we're going to be talking about beginning gardening. It's mainly meant for people that are just starting gardening, but maybe even an intermediate gardener would get a few facts out of this. So stay tuned and we'll be back in a minute and start talking. One of the first things that you have to scope out is where you're going to put your garden. You want to have at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight because most of the vegetables, if not all of them, will do better in full sunlight. So you want to stay away from trees, especially walnut, in the walnut family, butternuts, walnuts, any of those trees, because they secrete a naturally occurring herbicide. You also want to stay away from low spots in your yard because the vegetables will not tolerate being wet all the time, and so you want to have an area where when it rains, the water drains away in a day's time or so. You want to have the garden close to the house, or at least somewhere where you can see the garden, because that way it's more conspicuous and you can watch and keep the weeds down and watch the vegetables for their growth and when they mature. So locate your garden where you can enjoy it. One of the things that I tell beginning gardeners is not to plant too big of a garden, because most gardens are not just plant the garden and harvest the vegetables. You have to weed the garden, especially when the weeds are small, because if you don't keep the garden at least weed controlled, the weeds will get away from you, and pretty soon there'll be so many weeds that you just abandon the garden. So start small. Use vegetables that are easily grown, things like beans and radishes and lettuce, spinach, mainly the things that you like to eat. Peppers and tomatoes, of course. We'll talk a little bit about seed starting, but we'll probably be doing a separate video on seed starting. Choosing your vegetables. When you open the catalog and look at the pictures, don't just look at the pictures, read the descriptions, because the vegetables are meant for specific purposes. Like with radishes, if you want just the small radishes, the cherry bell will work really well, or a couple of rover is very good. But if you want to get them big, you want to use a variety like Champion. If you let the cherry bell get too big, the middle starts to get woody. They're best used when they're smaller. With the seeds that you're getting in the catalog, you want to also look at how many days to maturity, because especially in the northern climate like we are here in Wisconsin, if you have a vegetable that takes 90 days to mature, you want to get it started before you can plant the garden. So things like peppers and tomatoes, and even the cabbage family, it's probably good to get those started early, and that way you'll get your produce much earlier. With vine crops, especially watermelons, especially if they're the larger varieties, it's probably good to get the vine crops started indoors about 3 weeks before you're ready to plant them outside. So determine whether you have to start them inside or out, and we'll talk a little bit about direct sowing in a minute. The next thing I want to talk about is your soil. The plants will not do any better than the soil that you have them planted in. So there are basically 3 types of soil. There is the sandy soil. There are some advantages to sand, but there's also some disadvantages. The loamy soils like we have around here in Randolph, which are really great soils for a garden, although you still want to amend the soils. And then there are the clay soils. Those soils you want to amend quite heavily, because clay soil tends not to drain very well, and for root crops, if you want to grow nice carrots or beets or onions, you have to amend the soil so that you get better drainage and you have better soil texture. So with sandy soils, they drain very easily, but that also is a detriment because you have to water more often. So what we recommend with sandy soils, if you're starting with a new garden, that you add a lot of organic matter to the garden. And a very good source of organic matter is a compost pile. We'll be doing a video on composting later on too, so we'll have one available so we can show you how to compost. But another good source of compost is most municipal villages or cities have a compost area where they take all of the leaves in the fall and grass clippings that are generated and mix them together and let them compost in that area. And usually you can just drive up and take that compost and add it to your garden, and it makes very, very good organic matter. The organic matter will fill some of the spaces between the soil, the sand particles, and will hold the water in the area much longer, and also will hold your nutrients, because sand tends to leach the nutrients very fast. And so you want to get a lot of organic matter in the soil, especially if it's sand, and that way the nutrient holding capacity and the water holding capacity will be increased. I guess if I had a soil that I wanted to start with, I would love to start with a loamy soil sand, because you've got the drainage that you need, you've got the nutrient holding capacity, and the root crops can penetrate the soil very well. If you have a nice silt loam, you've probably got a great soil for drainage, you've got a good soil for organic matter, but you still want to add organic matter to the soil each spring before you plant, because that will make the soil texture better, it will increase the water holding capacity, and will give the vegetables the minerals that they need to grow and to succeed. Now with clay, clay holds the water really tightly because the soil particles are very small. So what you want to do if you're starting with a very poorly drained soil is to add a layer of sand. And you don't want to just add a little bit of sand, you want to add about a 2-inch layer of sand, and then about a 3 or 4-inch layer of organic matter, like composted leaves or well-rotted manure. If you have a friend that's a farmer and he will let you take some of the well-rotted manure in his pasture, that makes excellent organic matter for your soil. And you put that on top of the soil, and then you use a rototiller or another piece of equipment to incorporate it so that you get a homogeneous soil mix. And you want to have that soil mix go down about 6 to 10 inches, because most of the roots of vegetables require 6 to 10 inches of soil to make things grow. And so mending that clay, getting that, that sand and organic matter in will help with the soil drainage, so that when you get heavy rain, that the rain will drain away, won't cause a lot of root rot problems. So that should help you with the soils that you have in the area. If you're working up grass to start a garden, be sure you work up the grass so that it doesn't come back. Some people actually will kill the grass before they incorporate it, but if you have a rototiller, just rototill the grass until it's well mixed into the soil. We'll probably have some video on how to amend the soils also. Okay, now we'll talk about organizing your garden. You should not just open that seed packet and throw it away, but most of the seed packets will have a lot of information on it: the number of days to maturity, how tall the vegetable will get, when it's ready to harvest. And so what you want to do is orient your garden so that the taller vegetables are in the background, or if you've got like pole beans, or you've got any of the vining crops like cucumbers or small watermelons or any of the muskmelons. So if you're going to train them on a trellis, or you're going to put up some type of a structure that they can climb on, that should be in the back of the garden, not the front, because you don't want to shade the vegetables with that. If you're growing sweet corn, be sure you put that in the back of the garden. And then you put the things like carrots and radishes, things that are smaller, in the front of the garden, maybe peppers in the middle of the garden, tomatoes, depending on how you're going to trim them and how you're going to train them. You could have them in the middle part of the garden. But you should try not to shade the smaller vegetables with the larger vegetables, so keep them in the back. It's also a good idea to rotate the garden so that you're not planting the tomatoes in the same area that you planted them last year, because some of the soil diseases can build up in the soil and cause problems for the tomatoes if you're planting the tomatoes in the same location every year. We actually have a nice software package that we list in the catalog that you can get, and that has a lot of information in it. It helps you plan the garden. It's a computer application that you put on your computer, and you can keep track of every year where you planted what, and so you can plan the garden in the January and February time frame, so that you know exactly which vegetables you want to grow and where you've had them last year, so that you can rotate where they are. If you're a beginning gardener, as you get that garden going, like I said, use a smaller amount, make a smaller garden the first year so you can manage it. But if your neighbors are gardeners and good gardeners, it's also a good way to learn how to garden is to ask them questions, because they've gardened over the years. Every year you get better. One of the things that I recommend is that you have a notebook, so that when you start in the springtime, you can keep track of when you start your plants indoors, and if they're too tall or leggy, you can start them later in the season, and so that when you plant them out, they're the right size. If they're not big enough, you can start them earlier. We can tell you, and most seed packets will tell you about how early you have to start plants, but every house is different. When we start plants in the greenhouse, we have optimum conditions, both humidity and sunlight, and our seedlings will grow much faster than ones that are grown in the house in a sunny window or even under grow light. If you're growing plants in the basement and you're using the fluorescent lights, put a few incandescent bulbs in the light fixture so that you get a little red wavelength light, because if you're just using the blue wavelength light, the plants will tend to stretch and will not stay compact. Where if you have some of the red wavelength light, it tends to tell the plants not to get the large internodes like you would without that. If you're starting seeds, be sure you use a mix that has no garden soil in it. One of the main problems with starting seeds from scratch using garden soil is that garden soil has the microorganisms in the soil that are very detrimental to starting seeds. They like the same conditions as germinating seeds to germinate the spores that are in the ground, and so you have a lot more problems with damping off. What we recommend at Jung's is to use the Jung family seed starting mix or Jiffy mix. That's one that's been around for a long time, and use that soilless peat soil to start the plants, because then you're starting off with sterile media. Also, be sure you use a container that is clean, either a new container if it's plastic, or if you're using a milk jug, be sure you punch holes in the bottom so that the soil doesn't retain the moisture, doesn't get waterlogged if you overplant. And when you start the seeds, start one type of seed in each flat, so you don't start the tomatoes and the peppers and the cabbage family in the same container, because as soon as the seeds start peeking out of the soil. You've got to get them out of that really moist condition, and you take them out of a plastic bag. And some of the seeds have not germinated. They're going to maybe germinate or not germinate. So if you're going to start several varieties of tomatoes, start them in one flat. If you're starting a couple varieties of peppers, start them in another flat. If you're starting any of the cabbage family, cabbage, cauliflower, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, start them in another container because they do germinate at different speeds. And then just basically, when you start them in the soilless mix, when the time to transplant them is when they get 2 or 3 sets of true leaves, and then you gently tease them out of that soilless mix with a pencil, and then at that point you can add soil to your mix. And the mix that I prefer for growing my seedlings on is 1/3 sand, 1/3 soil, and 1/3 peat moss or compost. By the time the seeds have 2 sets of true leaves, they have strengthened enough so that if you water when the soil is dry and let it dry out between waterings, you won't have trouble with dampening off. And so the way to test to see if the plants need water is you feel the soil. If the soil is dry, you water heavy, and then you let them dry out between waterings. You don't water on a schedule. So, like I said, we're going to be doing a seed starting video, and we'll have more details on starting seeds in that video. We're going to be doing a video on Dick's Picks, which are the varieties in the catalog that I use in my own garden or would use in my own garden if I grew that particular vegetable. So we can go over some of the unique conditions that each of the vegetables use. That'll be a help for even expert gardeners. They'll pick up a few pointers that I use in my own garden. We're also going to be doing, or we have done, a video on how to build a raised bed garden. If you have a very clay type soil, a lot of people, rather than trying to garden in the clay soil, they'll build a raised bed garden. And the nice thing about a raised bed garden is you can grow your vegetables a lot closer together, and you can get much more produce and many more plants in a raised bed than you can in native soil. So we've already done a video on how to build or how I built my last raised bed gardens, but you can do a raised bed garden out of almost any material. A lot of videos on building raised bed gardens online. So those are some of the basics of starting your garden. If you have any questions, or if you want me to do a video on any subject, please get in contact with us, and we'll try to help you out. So this is Dick Zondag, the garden doctor, saying I wish you a great garden next summer. We'll be doing lots of videos on gardening in the next little period of time. If you like this video, please hit the like button at the bottom of the screen and subscribe to our YouTube channel.